Hello， 大家好，
大家好，
又係呢個讀你聽嘅時候啦。咁呢個 Dickens 嘅 Great Expectations 咧進入咗即係第二個階段啦，嚇。咁第二十節啦，咁樣。咁呢個進入咗新階段咁之前發生咗啲咩事啊？
發生咗嗰個男人喺城入邊嗰個男人啊，佢係咁同佢講話點樣大脅佢啊嗰啲嘛，之後都叫佢第時關照佢咁樣咯，仲有講
佢唔係城入面嘅，其實佢都係一啲佢識得嘅人啫嘛。Uncle Pumble 佢自己其實都唔係上流，佢想進入上流啫，佢扮係上流啫。跟住咧
就係同埋講阿 Dippy 同埋
Biddy 調翻轉，
同埋 Jo 咯，講佢哋唔知係咪阿 Pip 唔係咁 satisfy。
呢個再之前嗰回已經講咗啦。
咁點解佢哋好掛住佢咁啊？
歡送佢咯，同埋好似有掉隻靴出嚟嘅，喺佢嘅馬車走嗰陣時，我唔明白嗰個意味咯，可能係掉個靴意思，即係可能掉走啲衰氣咯，即係希望佢唔好翻嚟啦，即係咁。即係當然係善意嘅出發點啦，即係佢哋兩個係真心送走阿 Pip 嘅，真心想佢好嘅，但係亦都知道唔會再見到阿 Pip 啦，起碼即係一段長時間唔會見到佢啦。咁
同埋嗰個老婆婆講又知道佢發生緊咩事，但又唔肯定係邊一個賺資助。
其實上一回主要就係想描寫一樣嘢，就係當嗰啲人，包括啲裁縫啊、整鞋嗰啲人啊、整皮帶嗰啲人啊，當佢哋知道咗阿 Pip 佢今次禮真咯喎，佢真係有錢喎，佢真係要入城做上流社會嘅人嘅時候，對佢嘅態度係點樣改變啊？180度改變，係咪啊？即係而阿 Pip 亦都好充分感受到嗰種分別，即係上流階級嗰種待遇，而佢係我又唔可以話佢係享受緊嘅，但係佢好明顯係接受先啦，佢亦都唔會掩飾，唔會吝嗇，會攞啲錢出嚟，其實就係同你講嗱，我有錢，我要做靚衫入城。
咁佢係要咁做啊嘛。
即係佢亦都唔會隱藏啦。咁佢亦都做一啲嘢。而佢上咗馬車之後，有一個深刻嘅位就係佢話喺路上佢見到一個男人好似阿 Jo 嘅，但係佢
唔想見啊。
係佢反而其實係唔想見，因為佢自己內心其實都將
adjust 咗啦。佢
嘅過去擺喺後面，即係佢自己都想收埋佢啦。即係説明咗其實佢都係引自己嘅過去為恥啦，即係作為一個下等人，佢而家開始要受人哋尊重啦，受人哋敬仰啦，我唔需要即係頭耷耷做人啦，有一種咁樣嘅決心喺度啦，好嘛？咁但係佢只不過係啱啱開始啫，佢其實都唔知道究竟上流究竟係咩一回事，係嘛？咁睇下 Charles Dickens 點樣描寫進入上流呢一個情況係點啦，好冇？咁我哋繼續咯 ，Chapter 20啦。The journey from our town to the metropolis was a journey of about 5 hours。哇，都要5個鐘頭馬車啦。It was a little past midday when the 4-horse stagecoach, by which I was a passenger， 哇，4隻馬 got into the revel of traffic frayed out about the Cross Keys, Wood Street, Cheapside, London。即係去到 London 啦。We Britons had at that time particularly settled that it was treasonable to doubt our having and our being the best of everything. Otherwise, while I was scared by the immensity of London, I think I might have had some faint doubts whether it was not rather ugly, crooked, narrow, and dirty. Mr. Jaggers had duly sent me his address. It was Little Britain, and he had written after it on his card, just out of Smithfield, and close by the coach office. Nevertheless, a hackney coachman, who seemed to have as many capes to his greasy greatcoat as he was years old, packed me up in his coach and hemmed me with a folding and jingling barrier of steps, as if he were going to take me 50 miles. His getting on his box, which I remember to have been decorated with an old weather-stained pea-green hammercloth moth-eaten into rags, was quite a work of time. It was a wonderful equipage, with 6 great coronets outside and ragged things behind for I don't know how many footmen to hold on by, and a harrow below them, to prevent amateur footmen from yielding to the temptation. I had scarcely had time to enjoy the coach and to think how like a straw yard it was, and yet how like a rag shop, and to wonder why the horses' nosebags were kept inside, when I observed the coachman beginning to get down, as if we were going to stop presently. And stop we presently did, in a gloomy street, at certain offices with an open door, whereon was painted Mr. Jaggers. "How much?" I asked the coachman. The coachman answered, "A shilling, unless you wish to make it more." I naturally said I had no wish to make it more. "Then it must be a shilling," observed the coachman. "I don't want to get into trouble. I know him." He darkly closed an eye at Mr. Jaggers' name and shook his head. When he had got his shilling, and had in course of time completed the ascent to his box, and had got away, I went into the front office with my little portmanteau in my hand and asked, "Was Mr. Jaggers at home?" "He is not," returned the clerk. "He is in court at present. Am I addressing Mr. Pip?" I signified that he was addressing Mr. Pip. "Mr. Jaggers left word would you wait in his room. He couldn't say how long he might be having a case on, but it stands to reason, his time being valuable, that he won't be longer than he can help." With those words, the clerk opened a door and ushered me into an inner chamber at the back. Here we found a gentleman with one eye, in a velveteen suit and knee breeches, who wiped his nose with his sleeve on being interrupted in the pursuit of the newspaper. "Go and wait outside, Mike," said the clerk. I began to say that I hoped I was not interrupting, when the clerk shoved this gentleman out with a little ceremony as I ever saw used, and tossing his fur cap out after him, left me alone. Mr. Jaggers' room was lighted by a skylight only, and was a most dismal place. The skylight, eccentrically pitched like a broken head, and the distorted adjoining houses looking as if they had twisted themselves to peep down at me through it. There were not so many papers about, as I should have expected to see, and there were some odd objects about that I should not have expected to see, such as an old rusty pistol, a sword in a scabbard, several strange-looking boxes and packages, and 2 dreadful casts on a shelf, of faces peculiarly swollen and twitchy about the nose. Mr. Jaggers' own high-backed chair was a deadly black horse chair, with rows of brass nails round it like a coffin, and I fancied I could see how he leaned back in it and bit his forefinger at the clients. The room was but small, and the clients seemed to have had a habit of backing up against the wall, especially opposite to Mr. Jaggers' chair, being greasy with shoulders. I recall, too, that the one-eyed gentleman had shovelled forth against the wall, when I was the innocent cause of his being turned out. I sat down in the clientele chair placed over against Mr. Jaggers' chair, and became fascinated by the dismal atmosphere of the place. I called to mind that the clerk had the same air of knowing something to everybody else's disadvantage as his master had. I wondered how many other clerks there were upstairs, and whether they all claimed to have the same detrimental mastery of their fellow creatures. I wondered what was the history of all the odd litter about the room, and how it came there. I wondered whether the 2 swollen faces were of Mr. Jaggers' family, and if he were so unfortunate as to have had a pair of such ill-looking relations, why he stuck them on that dusty perch for the blacks and flies to settle on, instead of giving them a place at home. Of course, I had no experience of a London summer day, and my spirits may have been oppressed by the hot exhausted air, and by the dust and grit that lay thick on everything. But I sat wondering and waiting in Mr. Jaggers' closed room, until I really could not bear the 2 casts on the shelf above Mr. Jagger's chair and got up and went out. When I told the clerk that I would have take a turn in the air while I waited, he advised me to go round the corner and I should come into Smithfield. So I came into Smithfield, and the shameful place, being all a smear with filth and fat and blood and foam, seemed to stick to me. So I rubbed it off with all possible speed by turning into the street, where I saw the great black dome of St. Paul's bulging at me from behind a grimstone building which a bystander said was Newgate Prison. Following the wall of the jail, I found the roadway covered with straw to deaden the noise of passing vehicles, and from this, and from the quantity of people standing about smelling strongly of spirits and beer, I inferred that the trials were on. While I looked about me here, an exceedingly dirty and partially drunk minister of justice asked me if I would like to step in and hear a trial or so, informing me that he could give me a front place for half a crown, whence I should command a full view of the Lord Chief Justice in his wig and robes, mentioning that awful personage like waxwork, and presently offering him at the reduced price of 18 pence. As I declined the proposal on the plea of an appointment, he was so good as to take me into a yard and show me where the gallows was kept, and also where people were publicly whipped, and then he showed me the debtor's store, out of which culprits came to be hanged, heightening the interest of that dreadful portal by giving me to understand that 4 of them would come out at that door the day after tomorrow at 8 in the morning to be killed in a row. This was horrible, and gave me a sickening idea of London, the more so as the Lord Chief Justice's proprietor wore mildew clothes, which had evidently not belonged to him originally, and which I took it into my head he had bought cheap of the executioner. Under these circumstances, I thought myself well rid of him for a shilling. Dropped into the office to ask Mr. Jaggers had come in yet, and I found he had not, and I strolled out again. This time I made the tour of Little Britain and turned into Bartholomew Close, and now I became aware that other people were waiting about for Mr. Jaggers as well as I. There were 2 men of secret appearance lounging in Bartholomew Close and thoughtfully fitting their feet into the cracks of the pavement as they talked together, one of whom said to the other when they first passed me that Jaggers would do it if it was to be done. There was a knot of 3 men and 2 women standing at a corner, and one of the women was crying on her dirty shawl, and the other comforted her by saying, as she pulled her own shawl over her shoulders, "Jaggers is for him, Melia, and what more could you have?" There was a red-eyed little Jew who came into the close while I was loitering there, in company with a second little Jew whom he sent upon an errand. And while the messenger was gone, I remarked this Jew, who was of a highly excitable temperament, performing a jig of anxiety under a lamppost and accompanying himself in a kind of frenzy with the words, "Oh, Jaggereth, Jaggereth, Jaggereth! Oh, other Magareth, give me Jaggereth!" These testimonies to the popularity of my guardian made a deep impression on me, and I admired and wondered more than ever. At length, as I was looking out at the iron gate of Bartholomew Close into Little Britain, I saw Mr. Jaggers coming across the road towards me. All the others who were waiting saw him at the same time, and there was quite a rush at him. Mr. Jaggers, putting a hand on my shoulder and walking me at his side without saying anything to me, addressed himself as his followers. 哇，咁前衞嘅，嗰個年代已經有 followers 咯。First, he took the 2 secret men. "Now I have nothing to say to you," said Mr. Jaggers, throwing his finger at them. "I want to know no more than I know. As to the result, it's a toss-up. I told you from the first it was a toss-up. Have you paid Wennick?" "We made the money up this morning, sir," said one of the men submissively, while the other pursued Mr. Jaggers' face. "I don't ask you when you made it up, or where, or whether you made it up at all. Has Wennick got it?" "Yes, sir," said both the men together. "Very well, then you may go. Now I won't have it," said Mr. Jaggers, waving his hand at them to put them behind him. "If you say a word to me, I'll throw up the case." "We thought, Mr. Jaggers," one of the men began, pulling off his hat. "That's what I told you not to do," said Mr. Jaggers. You thought? I think for you. That's enough for you. If I want you, I know where to find you. I don't want you to find me. Now I won't have it. I won't hear a word. The two men looked at one another as Mr. Jaggers waved them behind again, and humbly fell back and were heard no more. And now you, said Mr. Jaggers, suddenly stopping and turning on to the two women with the shawls, from whom the three men had meekly separated. Oh, Amelia, is it? Yes, Mr. Jaggers. And do you remember, retorted Mr. Jaggers, that but for me you won't be here and couldn't be here? Oh, yes, sir, exclaimed both women together. Lord bless you, sir. Well, we knows that. Then why, said Mr. Jaggers, do you come here? My bill, sir, the crying woman pleaded. Now, I tell you what, said Mr. Jaggers, once for all, if you don't know that your bill's in good hands, I know it. And if you come here bothering about your bill, I'll make an example of both your bill and you, and let him slip through my fingers. Have you paid Wemmick? Oh, yes, sir, every farthing. Very well, then you have done all you have got to do. Say another word, one single word, and Wemmick shall give you your money back. This terrible threat caused the two women to fall off immediately. No one remained now but the excitable Jew, who had already raised the skirts of Mr. Jaggers' coat to his lips several times. I don't know this man, said Mr. Jaggers in the same devastating strain. What does this fellow want? Mother Jaggers, own brother to Abraham Latharouf. Who's he? Said Mr. Jaggers. Let go of my coat. The suitor, kissing the hem of the garment again before relinquishing it, replied, Abraham Labaroff on Thubitheon of Plate. You're too late, said Mr. Jaggers. I'm over the way. Holy Father, Mr. Jaggers, cried my excitable acquaintance, turning white. Don't they, you're again Abraham Labaroff? I am, said Mr. Jaggers, and there's an end of it. Get out of the way. Mr. Jaggers, have a moment. My old cousin's gone on Mr. Wemmick at this present minute to offer him heaven terms. Mr. Jaggers, have a quarter of a moment. If you have the condescendence to be bought off from the other side at any superior price, money no object. Mr. Jaggers, Mr. My guardian threw his supplicant off with supreme indifference and left him dancing on the pavement as if it were red hot. Without further interruption, we reached the front office, where we found a clerk and a man in velveteen with the fur cap. Here's Mike, said the clerk, getting down from his stool and approaching Mr. Jaggers confidentially. Oh, said Mr. Jaggers, turning to the man, who was pulling a lock of hair in the middle of his forehead, like the bull in Cock Robin pulling at the bell rope. Your man comes on this afternoon. Well, Master Jaggers, returned Mike, in the voice of a sufferer from a constitutional cold. After a deal trouble, I've found one, sir, as might do. What is he prepared to swear? Well, Master Jaggers, said Mike, wiping his nose on his fur cap this time. In a general way, anything. Mr. Jaggers suddenly became more irate. Now, I warned you before, said he, throwing his forefinger at the terrified client, that if you ever presume to talk in that way here, I'll make an example of you. You infernal scoundrel! How dare you tell me that? The client looked scared, but bewildered too, as if he were unconscious what he had done. Spoony, said the clerk in a low voice, giving him a stir with his elbow. Softhead, need you say it face to face? Now I ask you, you blundering booby, said my guardian very sternly. Once more and for the last time, what the man you have brought here is prepared to swear. Mike looked hard at my guardian as if he were trying to learn a lesson from his face, and slowly replied, either to character, or to have been in his company and never left him all the night in question. Now, be careful. In what station of life is this man? Mike looked at his cap and looked at the floor and looked at the ceiling and looked at the clerk and even looked at me before beginning to reply in a nervous manner. We've dressed him up like... When my guardian blustered out, What, you will? Will you? After some helpless casting about, Mike brightened and began again. He is dressed like a spectable pieman, a sort of pastry cook. Is he here? Asked my guardian. I left him, said Mike, sitting on some store steps round the corner. Take him past that window and let me see him. The window indicated was the office window. We all three went to it behind the wire blind and presently saw the client go by in an accidental manner with a murderous-looking tall individual in a short suit of white linen and paper cap. This guileless confectioner was not by any means sober and had a black eye in a green stage of recovery, which was painted over. Tell him to take his witness away directly, said my guardian to the clerk in extreme disgust, and ask him what he means by bringing such a fellow as that. My guardian then took me into his own room, and while he lunged, standing from a sandwich box and a pocket flask of sherry, informed me what arrangements he had made for me. I was to go to Bernard's Inn, to young Mr. Pocket's room, where a bed had been sent in for my accommodation. I was to remain with young Mr. Pocket until Monday. On Monday, I was to go with him to his father's house on a visit, that I might try how I liked it. Also, I was told what my allowance was to be. It was a very liberal one, and had handed to me from one of my guardian's drawers the cards of certain tradesmen with whom I was to deal for all kinds of clothes, and such other things as I could in reason want. I will find your credit good, Mr. Pip, said my guardian, whose flask of sherry smelt like a whole caskful, as he hastily refreshed himself. But I shall, by this means, to be able to check your bills, and to pull you up if I find you outrunning the constable. Of course, you go wrong somehow, but that's no fault of mine. After I had pondered a little over this encouraging sentiment, I asked Mr. Jaggers if I could send for a coach. He said it was not worthwhile. I was so near my destination. Wemmick should walk round with me, if I pleased. I then found that Wemmick was the clerk in the next room. Another clerk was rung down from upstairs to take his place while he was out, and I accompanied him into the street after shaking hands with my guardian. We found a new set of people lingering outside, but Wemmick made a way among them by saying coolly yet decisively, I tell you it's no use. He won't have a word to say to one of you. And we soon got clear of them and went on side by side. 咁啊，呢度就好深刻咁描寫呢個 Mr. Jagger 啦，佢嘅工作啦，佢嘅脾性啦，佢嘅工作環境啦，連佢嘅秘書啦，佢嘅 clerk 啦，都描寫埋佢嘅客人啦。即係講喺 London 呢個地方，即係你識法律同埋需要法律，亦都係兩個完全唔同嘅階級啦。你會見到 Mr. Jaggers 對待佢嘅客人係點樣嘅態度？係咯，明明係客人嚟嘅喎，佢有 job 俾你做喎。咁當然啦，呢啲客人睇嚟都唔係好多錢，但係佢哋都係有錢俾嘅。而阿 Jagger 最緊張嘅就係、你有冇見 Wemmick 啊？即係咁，你會諗下邊個 Wemmick 咧？但係你睇多幾次，提咗幾次就知道 Wemmick 多數就係佢嘅秘書啦。即係其實就係問你有冇俾錢，你俾咗錢未？咁你得啦，你俾咗錢得啦，你唔好咁多機格啦，我知點做啦。你再機格我就唔做。即係其實有一種咁嘅意味就係、可能 Mr. Jaggers 即係好多 job 咧，佢唔憂做咧。又或者係佢會唔會另一個曲線啲嘅講法就係、Mr. Jagger 佢係接好多 job， 但係佢接嘅 job 多數都係啲低下階層啲人嘅 job， 而佢嘅酬勞唔係好多，所以佢亦都好唔耐煩。會唔會係咁咧？咁但係呢個好明顯，即係一去到 London 第一個 impression 俾阿 Pip 其實就係唔係咁理想嘅，因為佢有形容到 London 嗰個狀態其實就係、啲街好窄啊，好灰暗啊，好邋遢啊。連阿 Jagger 佢自己 office 都係好邋遢啊，好多塵啊。即係其實俾佢印象唔係佢想象中咁好嘅。咁但係 London 喺國外人嘅心目中就係好好啦。你入城喎，你最巴閉啦，住喺倫敦咁咯。即係我諗啊 Pip first impression 就係覺得呢一個 Jaggers 係 有啲 mean 啦。雖然佢對佢唔係啦，即係對阿 Pip 係即係而家禮貌咗啦，比起之前。但係即係你見到 Jack 對佢嘅客人啊，對其他人都係比較上 mean 啊，冇耐性啊咁咯。同埋即係啲低下階層都係好明顯係受到好多苦楚啊，都係受到壓迫咯。並唔係醒入面嘅人就代表有好日子過，好冇？好。咁我哋下一次再繼續阿 Pip 嘅新嘅旅程啦。咁佢係有個酒店住下，暫時有個落腳嘅地方，咁啊可以適應下倫敦嘅生活啦。好嘛，下次再講啊。
OK。
拜拜。
拜拜。